Without further ado, we are about to begin. Okay, my name is Jasmine Bowens, and welcome to the 23rd City Lit Festival. Yeah. Held in partnership with the Maryland Center for History and Culture, where we're seated right now. Yes, I am a board member of City Lit, and we are not your ordinary literary nonprofit, and these are not ordinary times. Today, we celebrate the idea of bearing witness, declaring without question or thought that literature is a revolutionary act. The very act of writing, reading, listening, telling of stories, archiving them, and sharing them with the young and sitting with our elders is a way we honor history and our personal experience. Thank you. I got through that. Before you go, make sure you visit our literary marketplace. The literary marketplace is throughout the halls and also in the next room over. Okay. So our festival is free. All of our festivals are free that you see City Lit at. We hope you support by presenting authors. We hope you support presenting authors by purchasing their books and following them, and us on social media. Allow me a moment to acknowledge any City Lit staff, board members, leadership, council, gladiators, and volunteers who may be present. If you're in the room, please stand or wave. These are the creatives who work diligently behind the scenes. There's me, there's Carla, the volunteers. Today we want to thank the Maryland Center for History and Culture as our new festival partner, and Fulton Bank, who's in the back. We are also forever thankful for each of the funders and partners whose names are listed on the front of our program, some of whom have long known and championed our work throughout some lean years. Lean years meaning it's been some tough times, but we got through it. We are deeply grateful. Before we begin today's wonderful programs, Fashionista Icon of History, please mark your calendars for our upcoming events. On Tuesday, June 9th, in partnership with Greedy Reads, we present a masterclass with Courtney Malm, author of Before and After the Book Deal, called A Premise Isn't a Plot, on how she transforms a good idea for a novel into a transcript. On Saturday and Sunday, September 12th and 13th, the Baltimore Book Festival returns to Waverly with the City Lit stage on Saturday. But today, I have the honor of introducing our moderator, Camille Kashaka. Did I say that correct? Oh, great, okay. So Camille Kashaka serves as the managing director of Joe's Movement Emporium and creative Suitland. She is the former executive director of Motor House in Baltimore, coming aboard the organization immediately before the closure due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Pivoting to a mixed model of virtual and in-person programs with a dire economic landscape was a challenge her team confronted lovingly. Camille has served as the interim managing director at Hadaloo Theater in Memphis, Tennessee, and as the director of the Anacostia Arts Center in Southeast Washington, D.C., where she curated visual arts exhibitions, music series, and performing arts seasons, including curating the All the Way Live Tuesday Hip Hop series, creating the Resident Performing Arts Incubator in the Black Gold, an exhibition that celebrates Afrocentric aesthetics in both abstract and figurative work. So, I'm going to hand it over there. Thank you guys for sitting through that. So, Camille.
Thank you so much. Yay! And so now I have the honor and the privilege of introducing the three authors to my left. So we'll start with Dr. Elizabeth L. Block, an art and culture historian, a senior editor in the Publications and Editorial Department at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. She writes the popular Gilded Age Fashion newsletter and Instagram account at Elizabeth L. Block, and invites you all to join her there. Dr. Block earned her PhD in art history at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, with a focus on 19th century American painting. She also holds an MA in American Studies from Columbia University and a BA in English from the George Washington University. Okay, so yay! Gilded Age Fashion, 50 Iconic Looks and the Stories Behind Them. Hardy Grant 2026 is available now. This is a quote. Not only will fans of the Gilded Age swoon over the detailed photos of these sumptuous gowns, Block also provides a masterly peek at the customs and habits of those who wore them, whether to an afternoon tea or a society wedding. This is one to savor from Fiona Davis, New York Times bestselling author of The Stolen Queen. Beyond Vanity, The History and Power of Hairdressing is the winner of the Costume Society of America's 2025 Milia Davenport Publication Award. Her book, Dressing Up, The Women Who Influenced French Fashion, won the Victorian Society in America Book Award in 2022. Yay, Dr. Elizabeth Block. Next we have Piper Huguley. Her most recent biographical historical fiction book, American Daughters, 2024, is the story of the decades-long interracial relationship between Alice Roosevelt and Portia Washington, the rebel teenage daughters of President Theodore Roosevelt and Booker T. Washington, respectively. Her previous historical fiction book was By Her Own Design, a novel of Ann Lowe, fashion designer to the Social Register, William Morrow Publishing, which tells the inspiring story of the Black fashion designer of Jackie Kennedy's wedding dress, and was selected as the historical fiction winner for 2022 by the American Library Association's Reading Council. By Her Own Design has been optioned by Sony TriStar with Ruth Carter and Serena Williams as producers. Piper Huguley's novel follows the arc of Ann Lowe's amazing life from her childhood in Alabama, fashioning ethereal silk flowers to the greatest commission of her career, the wedding dress of Jacqueline Bouvier to John F. Kennedy. Piper teaches literature at Clark, yay, Clark, Atlanta. I didn't go there, but I'm from Atlanta, so. Clark Atlanta University, and blogs about the history behind her novels. She lives in Atlanta, Georgia with her husband and son. Also, one of this year's special features was the Writer's Room and with Piper Huguley on the historical fiction earlier today. So thank you for sticking around. Yay, clap it up. And then finally, we have Elizabeth Evitts Dickinson. She's the author of the critically acclaimed book, Claire McCardell, The Designer Who Set Women Free. Her first biography has been hailed as the best book of 2025 by the New York Times, NPR, Time, Kirkus, and the Washington Post, among many others. Claire McCardell earned an Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction Longlist Selection and Amazon Editor's Pick. Well, no, she didn't. You did.
The book is called Claire McCardell.
Okay.
It's so confusing. That's literally why my publisher's like, are we sure we're going to name it her name? Yeah.
Yes, an Amazon Editor's Pick for Best History and rave reviews from Oprah Daily, The Atlantic, Elle, Forbes, Harper's Bazaar, and All Things Considered and Morning Edition. Elizabeth's writing career encompasses cultural criticism, narrative fiction, investigative journalism, short fiction, and memoir. She's been widely published in places like The New Yorker, The New York Times, Harper's, The Washington Post Magazine, and The Southern Review, among others. Give it up for Elizabeth Evitts Dickinson.
Thank you.
Okay, is it 3:55 yet, or do we have time for more questions? Okay, so we're gonna start with a question about fashion as culture. Fashion, it represents who we are. It represents a group of people, their beliefs. All of the subjects of your books contribute to the culture, be it their own or a parallel culture. How do you think those contributions show up in your works, and even in today's cultural norms?
You want me to start?
Yes, I do.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. It's such a great question, right? Because as we were talking before we got on stage, you know, we tend to think of fashion as this thing that we all perform, but really it's a daily thing. Every day we have to get dressed, and every day we have to confront what we're going to wear and who we're going to be and how we're going to be seen, right? And so the woman that I wrote about, Claire McCardell, she was actually born in Maryland. She was born in 1905 right in Frederick, Maryland. And so she came of age at an interesting moment. She was a teenager in the 20s, and things were starting to get a little looser. Suffragists had earned the right to vote. There was a lot of optimism. And McCardell started to notice something in that moment. She grew up with 3 older brothers, and she was always really curious why her brothers got to wear these comfortable, meaningful clothes. Like, they had pockets and they had pants, and it was really easy for them to move about the world. But as you're going to hear about from Liz's book about the Gilded Age, Claire's mother came of this era that had a much more structured, much more rigid. There were a lot of rules about what a woman was supposed to wear, how she was allowed to be. And interesting, Ann Lowe, who you're going to hear about, kind of bridged those worlds in a lot of ways. But in terms of McCardell's cultural influence, I always like to ask, how many of you have a pair of ballet flats or know somebody who wears ballet flats, by a show of hands? What about a wrap dress? Do you have a wrap dress or you've seen a wrap dress? What about mix and match separates? Like those things, right? Claire invented ballet flats. She pioneered the wrap dress. She might have been the person who invented mix and match separates in the 30s. And she was doing all of this at a time when she was trying to assert her own autonomy and trying to really create an environment where women could lead fuller, more confident lives. And so we'll get into more about that in a bit, but really it was the culture of the time and her desire to sort of change the role that women were allowed to play in public life that led her to design the types of clothes that she made.
Okay, and so I write about women of the Gilded Age era, so we're talking about around 1870 to 1900, and I guess I'll do the show of hands type of question too. Does anyone watch the Gilded Age television show on HBO Max? Okay, good. Okay, so the dress of the time might strike us as sort of fussy. How did anyone get through the day wearing a corset and a bustle and all that heavy fabric? But what I look at and what I feel strongly about is that women of this era, late 19th century, were sentient human beings then, the same way they are now, and they wore the fashions that spoke to them, that telegraphed meaning and significance and what they wanted society to think of them. In many ways, they were saying out loud and proud. These were very wealthy women, so the 0.001% of society in the major urban centers in the United States, who were saying, we have the money to spend. Yes, our money may have come from our husbands, our fathers, our brothers, but we're spending it wisely and we're communicating. So I think one of the main themes for all of us here is how fashion is really a language. It's always communication. It's never just fabric.
Yes, that's very interesting that you put it that way, Elizabeth, in terms of Ann Lowe bridging both of these entities, especially she designed bespoke, custom, debutante, bridal, special occasion dresses for women of the social register. So for this particular clientele that you're speaking of, in terms of the 0.1% that could potentially afford an Ann Lowe gown, or at least what they were willing to pay her to do it. And the fact that these gowns, most poignantly in terms of the turn in fashion history, in terms of her designing that particular gown for Jackie, it kind of led to, I think, that what I call the big poofy white dress phenomenon launching in the 1950s, which I think is still kind of with us today in terms of making the bride this center point, this focal point of the day, which I think when I talk to a lot of my students about it or whatever, in terms of them thinking about, you just get married in your best suit. Regular everyday people, that's what they would do. It's kind of that dress, Jackie's dress, along with Grace Kelly's dress and Elizabeth Taylor's first dress. You have to say that because she had a number of bridal fashions that kind of kicked off this notion of the regular everyday person buying that one dress to wear and be that focal point for the day. So,
That is so interesting. It makes me think of another question that I didn't prepare you for, so I guess I am having some surprises. Two of the books features a specific designer, but all three books focus on the role of women in fashion. I'm wondering what your take is on how fashion as an industry has been liberatory for women in general.
I can take a little bit of that to start off with. So in the late 19th century, women in the United States were going to Paris for the most part, if they could afford to buy what we would call haute couture. At the time it was called couture gowns from the major design houses. So one of the best known was the House of Worth. There are many, many others to recover the names of: Jacques Doucet, Pingat, Poussin. A lot of women were making dresses just as beautifully as some of the larger houses. There's a lot more work to be done there. Women did own some of the houses and had their names on the front of the houses, but there were also scores of women who had names at the time, but whose names we have lost to this in the historical record, who were the seamstresses, who were the salespeople. These are all aspects of the fashion world that are fascinating to me, and who I've tried to recover as much as possible. It's possible to recover names of salespeople in personal letters from women who are buying fashion. It's a very exciting route, I think, for research, but also in the States. So there were dressmakers who owned their own rooms, houses, firms, whatever you want to call them, in all of the states. I've traced many in Baltimore, New York City, whose names we can only find when we're looking in the newspaper at their advertisements. So women were making the fashion, they were wearing the fashion, they were advertising the fashion, they were making the fabrics, they were sewing, et cetera, making the patterns, following the patterns, sewing at home quietly.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, when we have to it's worn out, I think. Yeah. When we think of women fashion designers, we can't name that many. And so isn't that interesting in terms of thinking about that? Yes, absolutely. And part of Ann Lowe's struggle in terms of, and she talked about this in the Soul interview featuring her in the Mike Douglas show in 1964, getting to be acknowledged as a fashion designer, using that terminology to describe her, as opposed to seamstress, which is when, if you look at a number of Jackie Kennedy biographies, that's how she's referred to, as a seamstress, and sort of making that differentiation. But even still, when you bring that up, thinking about all of those women who were seamstresses, who might have had some kind of creative, more input in terms of what it was that they were doing in terms of the apparel that they sewed. But for, at least in terms of thinking about it being liberatory for her or whatever, during the time she's coming up, being born in Jim Crow, Alabama, in the first half of the 20th century, majority of black women are in domestic, nursing, potentially teaching professions, and she had it in her mind from the very beginning, that encouraged by her mother and grandmother, who were also in this same line, to dare to dream to become a fashion designer. And she made a pathway for herself to do that, even as erasure to some extent still happened for her.
It's interesting because Claire McCardell had a similar situation where she was lucky enough to have parents who believed in education. So, in the 1920s, not every girl got to go to college, but Claire's grandfather co-founded Hood College in Frederick. And what's interesting about that is that it had a strong domestic arts program, which, if you're my age, you remember domestic arts as being like you had to bake a bunch of cookies and it felt like housewifery. But really, the domestic arts, home economics, was founded as a backdoor for women into the sciences. In the late 1800s, it was seen as a way for women to learn about bacteriology and science and textiles. And what you start to see in America is you start to see women at places like Iowa developing textiles and making the pantyhose that had the tensile strength to last through the workday. McCardell always wanted to be a designer, but interestingly, because there was such a habit of America looking to Paris, there was no such thing as an American designer. It didn't exist. So when McCardell said to her father, I want to go to New York and study fashion and be a designer, he's like, what? All he knew was the worst story ever, which was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. If you're familiar with that, it's women in 7th Avenue working in a factory in, what, was it 1913? And it was one of the worst fires in the history of America, let alone New York. And the women who died in there were seamstresses, nameless in a lot of ways for years, because they were locked in to keep working by the factory owners. So it was a really big deal for McCardell to go to New York and pursue this. And in the 1930s and 40s, this era between the wars, it was women who built the American fashion industry. It was women who ran the department stores, who designed, who built the publicity around, who created New York Fashion Week, a woman named Eleanor Lambert. She developed that in 1943. None of that existed. And so part of my interest in writing this book was I wanted to recover that story of how these women between the wars built an entire industry effectively at a time when they couldn't have their own checking accounts, they couldn't get credit, and Claire was white. She had it easier than Ann Lowe, who's running her business uptown and like had all like twice the obstacle to it. And so in a lot of ways, fashion allowed them a way to become professional, but also to build a place where they could network and become active participants in civic and cultural life.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I also want to, so we've talked art as, or fashion as culture, fashion as liberation in some ways. I'd like to talk fashion as art. And I want to start with Ann Lowe, because in your book, there's a moment where she self-identifies as an artist. And it's when she's leaving her man. So her abusive husband.
I was about to say she had 2 husbands, so which one she? Because both
The first
of them
one.
got left.
The first one.
Yeah, the predator.
Yeah. Yes, the predator.
Yeah, I say that because it's hard to establish these things historically because they didn't keep birth certificates for Black people in Jim Crow, Alabama. But it is believed that she was a child bride of 12. So that's why I call him the predator.
I mean, he was, according to the book, almost 3 times older than her.
Yeah,
So.
and I believe, my theory is that he used her as labor. He was a tailor himself, and I believe that he used her skills to his end in terms of that. So your question.
So the question is about
art.
fashion as art, and specifically why fashion. So it's not just the designer that gets to be artistic with fashion. It's also the wearer.
Yeah.
So when we're putting looks together, not the royal we, because Camille is stressed out by it, but there are people, there are stylists. I have a coworker who every day is a look. And there is some creative, some artistic satisfaction that comes from it. Why do we think that is?
Go ahead. Yeah,
This is working now. Oh, it's working now.
Okay, good.
So I love what you said about putting together the look. And so thinking about these women in the late 19th century who may have had taste or may not have had taste. So very famously, Alva Vanderbilt was nouveau riche. She came from, I think, Mobile, Alabama, to New York, and her rival was Caroline Astor, who was from a Knickerbocker family and had decades, generations worth of wealth that she had married into. So she was always, Caroline Astor was always considered to have taste. And Alva Vanderbilt was considered to just want whatever was the latest and to put together outfits that just showed what money could buy. And we know from newspaper reports, from descriptions in magazines who love to cover, these gossip columns love to cover what the women were wearing to evening events and to balls, that Caroline Astor re-wore dresses all the time. She re-wore, she loved to wear black and she loved to wear deep purple, but what she would switch out were the heirloom jewels, whereas Alva Vanderbilt was going for what was new and just kind of clashing together whatever was possible. So as far as styling, I want to mention also, we've been talking, one of the cross currents here is about unknown labor without names that we can attribute as of yet, is that I think we have this whole profession of stylists today who do a lot of the putting together of the outfits for celebrities that we see, and the taste is coming from them, and the artistic eye is really coming from the stylists, whose names we often don't get credited in newspapers and magazines. But at the time, in the late 19th century, I think a lot of that was happening from the salespeople in these couture houses. And they were putting together looks, and they were fitting looks together for clients who they thought it would work for. So it's always a network, it's always a community.
That's so interesting because, McCardell came of age during modernism. And whereas the haute couture designers and Ann Lowe were making things largely by hand, right? McCardell was trying to harness mass production. She was wondering, how do we take the art of fashion and marry it with mass production and create ready-to-wear? And she always thought of herself as living in that intersection of art and commodity, because that's what fashion is, right? It's, if you can't wear it, then it's not very practical as a fashion object. And what's interesting is that that whole mid-century generation starts to think of themselves not just as fashion designers, but as designers. This is the rise of industrial design, the rise of modern architecture. Rockefeller Center is going up. Frank Lloyd Wright is building his houses. And McCardell became not only the first woman to get her name on her own label and recognized as a designer, but in the 1950s, she was celebrated in a museum of modern art in Los Angeles, a gallery show that normally showed artists like Matisse and Picasso. They showed McCardell. And one of my favorite moments is that McCardell said, don't try and follow fashion. Fashion is fickle. And if you try and follow fashion, you're going to exhaust yourself. She said, comfort is the keynote of style. Wear what makes sense for you. And at this big gallery opening where stars from Hollywood and Neiman Marcus and all these famous people are coming, she wore a 10-year-old dress that she loved, that she felt comfortable in, and that she styled with new bangles. And so I always came away from my research of McCardell remembering that the real power in fashion as an art is in giving you the capacity to live the way you want to live in it.
Okay, let's stick with McCardell for a little bit. What about her first inspired you to do this deep dive? Because you really get into her as a human being. So what got us here?
Well, so first of all, right upstairs here at the Maryland Center for History and Culture is her archive. So my first job out of college was here, and I saw an exhibition of her clothes. And I was just blown away by what I saw. I couldn't believe it. It seemed very contemporary, even though it was decades old. And the thing about McCardell is she was incredibly famous in her lifetime. She was on the cover of Time magazine, the cover of Life. She was on the news, in newspapers, on the radio. She was a household name by the time she died. And it always made me wonder why we forgot her name. And why it is that the fashion industry today has not. So if you ask Calvin Klein or Tory Burch or anybody who's making American sportswear today, they'll say Claire McCardell is their inspiration. And the thing about all the writing at the time in these archives, they all say she's the shy, quiet girl, because you're always called a girl, from Frederick, Maryland. And I thought to myself, that doesn't track. How does a shy girl help invent the American fashion designer? How should she start her own company? How does she break the ceiling, get her own name on her label? And I just felt like there was a much bigger story about how she did it. And that's kind of what got my curiosity going.
What do you think it is? Why do you think that Christian Dior is still a household name and Claire McCardell is not in the same way?
I think it's a couple of things. I mean, some of it is honestly sexism in that, there was a moment where most American designers in the 30s were women. We've forgotten all of their names, and sadly we forget a lot of women's names because they've been lost to history. Some of it was just the nature of being in ready-to-wear and mass production versus being in haute couture. So Christian Dior, everyone knows him, He came on the scene in 1947, around the time that Claire McCardell was really famous. And whereas McCardell was saying, I want women to dress for themselves, Dior was saying, I want women to be objects. I want women to be pleasing to a man's eye. I want them to be, as he said, he wanted to save them from nature. So what he was doing was he was putting them back into corsets. He was putting them back into bustle. He was putting them back into these very restrictive undergarments. McCardell had really gotten rid of all of that because her desire was to let women, be free. Christian Dior and Claire McCardell died within 3 months of each other. But the French system, because it was so old and it had such a business model to it, there was a system for naming a predecessor in an haute couture French firm. Claire McCardell was kind of building the bridge as she was walking across it, and there literally wasn't precedent at the time to carry on the name of a dead, ready-to-wear designer's label. And so they stopped making the clothes under her name shortly after she died. And now, of course, that would never happen, right? Now we keep those ready-to-wear labels ongoing, but she was a visionary and she was a little bit ahead of her time.
Fascinating. I hate that for her. And Paris comes up a lot in between the three books, or among the three books. In The Gilded Age, first of all, it's a beautiful book. We love photos with context. It's fantastic. It was a great experience. But most, if not all of those pieces were made in France, right?
Right. In the book, most, if not all, of the pieces are made in France. I wanted to provide a sense of some of the largest houses. So there are dresses by House of Worth and La Ferrier and Paquin. But there were certainly American makers that should be worked in. I think actually I do have one by Catherine Donovan, who's a dressmaker in New York City, who became quite well known and ended up making the wedding dress for Consuelo Vanderbilt when Doucet in Paris became unavailable, much to the chagrin of Consuelo's mother, Alva Vanderbilt. So there are New York dressmakers. So I think I do have one by Catherine Donovan, but there's just so much more work to do. There are more dresses by Catherine Donovan. I just saw one in Florence at the Palazzo Pitti 2 weeks ago that I've only seen in reproduction. It's in incredible shape and it needs new photography, and I will get it into a book one day. But yes, Paris certainly looms large.
Well, I want to stick with that for a little bit because I'm curious about how much time and money these women or these families invested in going to France.
Yeah, there was no budget. There was no maximum to they just had all the money in the world. This small percentage of Americans who would go over to Paris sometimes twice a year for the 2 seasons. There were seasons in fashion back then, so for fall and for spring, and they would go, like Carolyn Astor would go to Paris for 6 weeks at a time. She would stay in an apartment that she rented. Other people stayed in hotels. They traveled around, and they were doing other things while they were there, but they would go into the couture houses, get their measurements taken, because women in this era and in many eras were having multiple children over the years, and so their dimensions changed. So the houses would keep the measurements on file and then remeasure and place their orders. Because these were handmade, the dresses were never finished by the time the women left Paris to head back to New York or Cincinnati or Chicago. So they would be shipped, and they would come over on a steamship, and they would be shipped in these beautiful boxes with tissue paper, and they would be scented. And it's a whole process, but it's very, very Parisian.
Well, and then what America was doing is America was sending over spies.
Yes,
So,
indeed.
Yeah,
Yes.
so America would send over spies because we had 7th Avenue that was just trying to replicate French design, and they would send young women in, or women who posed as socialites, to go in and watch the showings or see the clothes, and then they'd sketch them and steal them, and then the American designers would copy them.
Yes, there were unlicensed versions that happened. There's fake labels that people have traced, and there were licensed versions. I mean, there were, but it's really fun to find the knockoffs.
This is centuries of this. That's crazy.
Oh, yeah.
Did you want to add something? I felt like you were going to.
Well, no, I mean, about Paris?
Yeah.
I mean, well, yeah, Ann Lowe got to make the one trip over. She went as a journalist, yeah, for a black publication in New York. And apparently, this is what we know, met Christian Dior over there who had admired her work. Who knows how much of it he took her work, but, you know.
Well, and Ann Lowe was considered like she was a couture. I mean, she was Paris. I mean, she had the skill and the quality of work, and she was doing it in much smaller. You know, she didn't have these huge houses with 100 seamstresses at her disposal.
And that work that she had learned from her mother and her grandmother, pointedly, who, and apparently her great-grandmother, who, her great-grandmother and her grandmother who'd been enslaved in Alabama, but to the point where, at least for those women, or what those women were doing in the South during that particular point in time, antebellum Alabama, there was an agreement that her grandmother's freedom was purchased, but she had to stay there so that she could continue to create. This is what she was doing, creating the gowns for her former owners, enslavers, to do that, which leads to that one little scene or that point in the book when Anne is wondering, was that really freedom?
Yeah.
One of the things that really struck me about Ann Lowe, too, is that, you know, Christian Dior, again, I put in the book a lot about the way he was having women shape their bodies to his design, to his vision. It was really the male gaze. What's interesting about Ann Lowe to me is that even though she was creating styles and was often told somewhat what to do, I remember hearing about dresses where, like, she was so thoughtful about a woman's experience and a woman's body. Like, she really made dresses with the wearer in mind, and I think that that's something that really is really admirable and sort of unique about what she was doing at the time in her clothing.
Yeah, and that's one of the thoughts that I had when I was thinking about her character in terms of, and it's something you can tell because I was writing the book during the pandemic, so I didn't get to see things in person or whatever, but the thesis that Margaret wrote in terms of what she talked about in terms of her research about Ann Lowe, she took photographs of the insides of her dress, and it was one of the things that made me think about how she was thinking about the wearer, certain things that she would do in terms of the creation of the dress that made it that. So that's why.
And my memory is that she designed one for a young pianist, and the bow, instead of having to sit on the bow on the bench, she did it so that the bow would flow beautifully off the bench. And so it was this gorgeous dress, but it was literally figured in such a way that it looked beautiful while she was standing, and then it flowed while she sat to play.
Which was one of the dresses, I believe it was on display at the Winter Fair exhibit a couple of years ago.
But this is why she's my new hero, because she's doing things like that. There's a scene where, and I won't get too far into it, but her husband exacted some violence against her and ripped a skirt. And during the violent act, she's thinking of how she can repair the skirt. If it's ripped in the place that I think it's gonna be ripped, I can add some grapevines and make it real cute like that. Like, yeah, I mean, she was disassociating, but also, like, artistically.
Yeah.
And I think there's another scene. I think it's the first time she goes with her mom to a white woman's house to help. And her mom is like, you don't speak unless spoken to. You need to act right when we're here. And immediately she was like, I think you need to add a sash. I think you need a sash.
Sassy.
So I do kind of want to move into gender. How, and all three of you, please feel free to add. And I love that I meant to say this, feel free to ask each other questions. But in what ways is gender showing up in these designs? And in what ways are they sort of being, like, preconceived notions of gender sort of being kicked to the curb?
I didn't really before you asked that question, I've been asked a lot of questions over these last almost 4 years. That was not a question I had thought about. Yeah, in terms of that. I just, think Ann Lowe has a particular signature, which is her floral touch, which across several of her designs has been executed in a variety of ways in terms of that. But I just feel like she has, one of the thoughts I had about her including that or incorporating the flowers as a touch was sort of associating the floral touch with femininity, with a womanly aspect. So, but it's a very fascinating question.
In the late 19th century, the very structured dresses that we're used to seeing are they're very controlled in a way. They're overtly feminine for sure, but the women, I believe, and through my research, I believe, show that they were part of the aesthetic process of deciding what would be made for them. I mean, these were women that just had so much money, so much power. They were helping fuel the Parisian fashion industry, which was central to the French economy. And I know from their letters that they were weighing in on what color fabric they wanted, and that they would have a back and forth with these male designers and say what they wanted. We were talking earlier about, some of us, about underclothing, that these women were wearing corsets under these gowns. They were wearing it under, not so much, well, for the most part, not so much with their morning gowns, which were sometimes called tea gowns, but with their afternoon dresses, with their evening dresses, with their ball gowns, with their wedding dresses. And that gave a certain look, a certain sculptural quality to the overall look. The undergarments helped do that, but I strongly believe that the undergarments were comfortable for them.
McCardell wanted to blow things up a little bit. Yeah, she borrowed heavily from menswear. She really thought it was silly that clothes were gendered. She thought it was silly that color and material were gendered. But she was living at a time when you could still get arrested for wearing pants in public as a woman. On a public beach, you had to wear wool swim stockings or you could get arrested. And so there were these rules. And so it's worth remembering that these rules were written into municipal codes. They were law, right? There were laws about women, what they could wear. You could be arrested for wearing a clothing style that wasn't your gender. And McCardell thought it was ridiculous. And so in a lot of ways, McCardell is sort of an extension of what began in the late 1900s, which was the rational dress movement. This idea that women's clothes should be as practical as men's clothes. And you can see that in some of the early suffragists who had pockets and bloomers, and it was seen as scandalous, right? But they wanted to ride bikes. They wanted to not have to do it in long skirts. And so McCardell made a lot of interesting design choices. She used materials that were traditionally considered male. She made wrap dresses out of denim. She saw that silk ties were much sturdier than the silk that women were being sold. So the salesmen loved her because she'd be like, give me the stuff you're selling to the men. She put all of her closures on the side so that you could get dressed alone without having to get help from a man.
Can I just interject? Yeah. This is personal. I also work for a storytelling company. And we were in rehearsal the day I read about that. One of the women told her story, and her story was about how she was about to get on stage, but she went to the bathroom. She was in a jumpsuit that zipped up in the back. She unzipped, used the restroom, and could not zip back up. And the whole story is about the crisis of zipping it. And I said, has she worn one of Claire McCardell's pieces? But go ahead.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Because it wasn't just that she wanted the clothing to be practical. She thought pragmatism was beautiful. And I loved the way she thought, because she really was just like asking these obvious questions that I think visionaries ask, which is, why are we allowing the system to be the way the system is? And so, really her desire to create mix and match separates was kind of mimicking a male suit. It was this idea that she had to get on these ships to go to Paris every year because she was still being told to steal Parisian designs. She didn't want to carry a big trunk full of dresses that she had to change into at different hours of the day. So she's like, what if I make 5 pieces out of black wool jersey and I could mix and match them during my trip and I can pack it in a suitcase? And now how many Instagram stories are there about, like, here's how you pack a weekend bag, you know? She was thinking about this in the 1930s. And so for her, she really said, I think that sportswear made women independent. Like, it allowed us to live lives. It allowed us to do our own thing every day and not be beholden on anybody.
And sportswear means something different from what I think, because I feel like these leggings are sportswear, but that's not.
But leggings were one of the things she helped to pioneer back in the day. But yeah, sportswear it's not Lululemon, right? Sportswear is a category of clothing that covers pretty much the casual, comfortable clothes. Like, this is considered sportswear. You know, what Ralph Lauren, what Calvin Klein, what those types of designers, Halston was considered sportswear in a lot of ways. And so really it's this larger category of the casual, modern clothes that we wear today in America.
Okay, I'm gonna come back to you. These women, how many times a day are they changing clothes?
They could be changing clothes up to 5 or 6 times per day. And that is how I organized the book, because it's one of the questions that I always get. And I wanted to lay out what a woman would wear in the morning, afternoon, evening, special occasions. And it depended really, were they in their home? Were they just with their family having breakfast? They could wear what was called a tea gown, for which you didn't have to wear a corset per se, and was not ornamented and was not ornate. And then afternoon dress required long sleeves, and you had to have the certain stockings and certain shoes and a coat, and if it were winter, you had a fur muff and all the accessories, and you always had to have your hair done. In evening, you could have a lower décolletage, and you could have short sleeves. So there were all these rules that the etiquette books were putting out. But it sounds grueling to us today. But again, these were people with brains who were helping fuel an entire economy. They were running philanthropies. They were funding schools. They were funding libraries. They were doing work. And I think that it probably wasn't as arduous as we think it would be, because we're envisioning ourselves trying to do that. And also, to your point about not being able to zip up the back of a dress, these ladies all had ladies' maids to do all of that. And so the work of getting dressed was really co-work. It was with a helper, and sometimes, you know, if you had a sister in the house, the sister would help.
And it was like the Vanderbilts and people who created places that, through their philanthropies, allowed women like Claire McCardell to have housing in places like New York, because they created these nonprofit houses for women. Yeah, so you see how they're like, and they would give people like Claire their hand-me-downs, and Claire learned how to sew well because she was able to take apart for cheap the haute couture that these wealthy women like the Vanderbilts and the Astors had.
I have one more question that's gonna go to you. So in your book, I found that a lot of the progress that Anne made was due to other women. So her mom and grandma taught her how to sew. Her escape from her first husband was facilitated by a kind white woman with a lot of money. But I never got the sense that Anne wasn't self-made at the same time. She was very much the master of her own story. How were you able to balance Anne at the center and still give props where props were due and give criticism where criticism was due?
I really had the thought from the beginning, it sort of reverts back to one of your earlier questions about fashion as art, of her as an artist. Artists need patrons in order to be able to do their art. And so she had that nurturing soil with her mother and her grandmother, to be sure, whatever. But yes, it was her capacity when she was able to escape from her predator via Josephine Lee, who was real and who I see as a patron, that she saw her in, she would dress in a very muted way. She was always about having her work be the center point, not her. But that Josephine Lee had a good eye and could see that her clothes were well made, and asked her, just in a department store where she randomly was, who made your clothes? In this book, I had the scene play out one way, but Ann Lowe in real life actually said, I made these clothes. And that is how she was able to connect with Josephine Lee, move to Tampa, which is where the citrus grove magnates lived, and became, as of note, and this was a very unique and singular thing. In the 1920s, the designer for the Gasparilla Festival, 3 years running in the 1920s, where her name was in the newspaper in Tampa, kind of thing. It's not a thing that happened for Black women at that time in terms of notes. So it was these things where she had the support of people like Josephine Lee, and that support with the Lees and the Lee family continued across the rest of her life. But that's how I saw her as an artist. One of Josephine Lee's great-grandsons reached out to me and said that there's a whole thing about in the Lee family, whether you were a Lee daughter or you were marrying into the Lee family, that Ann Lowe would make wedding gowns for them at any point in time. So she was an artist in terms of what she did.
Fantastic. So, okay, so do I need to walk around with the...
Hello, everyone. We have a little bit of time for some Q&As. Does anyone have any questions? All right.
Should I stand? Does it matter? Okay. Hi. Fantastic panel. Thank you so much for bringing your expertise. I have a question about war and its impact on the lives of all three of your subjects, and how you think the new war might impact fashion.
Okay, mid-20th century people.
Oh, you should probably.
Well, World War II impacted American fashion extremely because Claire made one of the last trips to Paris before it shut down, before the Nazis closed it off. And so Paris went dark. There was no way to go back and steal. McCardell didn't want to do that anyway. And so it was really because of the war that a lot of these American designers had the ability to finally showcase their capacity. And it became what was known as the American look. They were putting themselves in direct conversation against Paris and trying to like create the New York style. So in some ways, World War II, for as dire as it was, it helped American fashion industry. I will let you continue, and then maybe we can talk about the future.
No, I just, in the book I have it as a downtime for Anne. There's not the capacity to have a lot of big frou-frou, foo wedding gowns.
Right, because there were clothing rations.
There were clothing rations. You didn't have the fabric available. You didn't have the silk available, even though, there was a whole thing with parachute wedding dresses that people made out of parachutes to repurpose the silk. I didn't bring that into the story or whatever. I just put, that's how I characterized it for her, as was the time. Everybody's getting married in their suits, it's like, oh, darn, nobody's, coming to me for this kind of thing. And also you have, not as many debutante balls and all that other kind of stuff. So it impacted her output greatly at that particular point in time. As far as today, I'm saying that I'm seeing a lot, particularly on Instagram, a lot of young people who are very resourceful about vintage fashion. I don't know what might happen as a consequence of this, but I just see so much resourcefulness out there. I know it'll be something great, I think.
Yeah, I think there's been a backlash to fast fashion.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw, like, with global trade and, like, right, it's not just war, right? It's, like, politicians making arbitrary decisions about tariffs. Fashion is a global thing, and it always has been. Like, you couldn't get your fabrics from Paris when they were shut down. And so, of all the myriad ways in which politics are messing things up right now, yeah, I think it can both stymie free trade and free expression and free communication, but create a level of resourcefulness that might engender something that we couldn't have imagined, which is the only bright side I can see, if there is one.
Yeah, and I'll add that for the earlier period, Gilded Age fashion really ends when World War I begins, and so you eventually get much less fabric because no one wanted you to be wasting money or resources on long gowns. So dresses start to get shorter, and fast forward to the flapper era, that's when we eventually get sort of dancing dresses that show a little bit more skin and end up, I mean, war always brings about ingenuity and change, and we get in this era, in the 1920s, so after World War I ends 1918, you get these shorter dresses that women could dance and move more freely in, and they're sort of considered boyish or mannish, and were considered a threat to society as usual. But women could really move in them, and they were also sort of kinetic. They would have like rhinestones or little faux pearls along the border of the skirt, and you could get this sort of like sound while you were dancing. So fashion really always changes after war, and I'm, for the current moment, very, very interested to see what will change in terms of color for fashion. I haven't seen any changes come around yet, but I keep waiting, and I wrote about this in my newsletter, Gilded Age Fashion on Substack. If you're on Substack, let me know. About like where are all the dark clothes for dark times. And you know, right as this Iran scenario, war was being started, the spring fashion shows were coming out of London and Paris and New York, and it was so jarring to me because the colors in those shows were all pastel and all diaphanous fabrics, like see-through, completely impractical. And of course, those would have been conceived of months before, but it just looked so anachronous to me that I can't help but wonder what's going to change in terms of color and fabric.
Hello, thank you for that. We have time for one and maybe a half questions. So here, state your name.
Hi, my name is Chelsea. Thank you for your panel. It was really interesting. I'm thinking about so many things, and I really love what you said about fashion as communication and sort of forgotten designers like McCardell makes me think of Liz Claiborne and how popular she was, and now you see her sort of drifting in the thrift stores and, you know, bibbidi-bobbing around there. But I'm curious as to what you think about what fashion is communicating today, especially with low-income women. I think sometimes, I think it's a lot easier now to kind of communicate that you might have more money than you have, or you're communicating certain levels of status. So I'm just curious what you think about what fashion communicates today.
I mean, this might not be what you were intending with that question, but I've been really, I write in the book about how, you know, Dior wanted to bring back the wasp waist. And it was called a wasp waist because it was as thin as the segmented of a wasp, right? He wanted an 18-inch waist, right? Get out of town. And so there was this idea, again, of creating that really severe hourglass. And guess what? It's back. And I think there's something really, if you look at what Jeff Bezos' wife got married in, it was a corseted wasp waist. Her dress leading up to the event was this very wasp waist. It's what you're seeing like the wealthy do. Kardashians are doing it, right? The people with the money and I always ask my students when I teach, what does it say about politics and time that this is happening in this moment, at the moment that the trad wife is back, and this idea that women are supposed to get back into the kitchen. Fashion has a signal, right? And what happens if you're so tired because you're hungry? Like literally, women are getting their ribs, there's a rib surgery where you can get your ribs shaved down to have an hourglass waist. And so right now I'm really seeing a lot of politics in fashion. And I don't know if that answers your question, but it's real interesting to me.
There's also the effect of the GLP-1s on fashion. So I've been reading about that a little bit as to, like you're saying, the size of the waist and reshaping your body at will. And that the makers of fashion are making designs that are can work with you as your body changes, so that you don't have to buy a new outfit as you increase your dose or scale off your dose. I mean, it's really, I'm not sure there's anything that compares quite to this. So adjustable clothing that's high end, not necessarily sportswear, but adjustable based on medication that you may be taking. It's interesting to watch.
Can I just say I love Baltimore fashion? I feel like Baltimore has the best fashion because it's very homegrown and it's very honest and it's very like, Baltimore is crushing it right now. Being the local girl, I wanted to throw that in.
Okay, it is past the time, but if anyone has any other quick questions, we can take them before we end the session. All right, here we go.
Next books for any of you?
I was just saying I'm coming back through Baltimore in June, rather because I'm going on a road trip. I'm doing more research into the life of Elizabeth Evitts, who was Mary Lincoln's dressmaker. So,
I love to hear that. My next one is on underclothing, so you might have sensed that from my talk about corsets and bustles.
My next book, which is coming out next year, is a cultural history and a true crime story about the ruby slippers from the Wizard of Oz. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay.
I'll tell you more about it after if you want to know.
Did you guys all answer? Or do you have? Okay, great. So, oh, please. Oh my God. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 23rd City Lit Festival. Please support City Lit Project. Follow us online. Also, before you leave, fill out the evaluation form so we can see what we can do better next year. And also check out our website, the news section. There's always stuff going on. And before you leave, check out the marketplace as well. So, yeah, hang out. I think we have like 2 hours left, but thank you, everyone.